argue that it's necessary to have geography. I argue that it's necessary to have history. We need to understand the history of the NUM in platinum. And one of the most striking things it seems to me about the NUM is its capacity for self-criticism. The NUM kept commissioning SWOP to do service delivery studies in order to understand where the problem areas were with service delivery in the Union. And if one reads the Secretariat report for the 2012 SWOP meeting, and you look at the Russenburg section, there's an extraordinary level of self-criticism that one finds, and so that I'm kind of joining with the NUM itself, although I think the question mark that I see over the future of the Union in platinum is perhaps a little larger than the Union officials who are here. I want to argue in the most general terms that if you are a union, you have to negotiate. But if you negotiate, you have to bring your members with you. That means that union negotiators need to operate very inclusively and with a substantial measure of trust from their members. And if union members act unilaterally, then union negotiators need to go back to their members and then represent the members' concerns as clearly as possible to managers. If you're a mine manager, you have to coordinate a hugely complex logistical operation safely and efficiently. At, say, Bafokeng North, 10,000 workers have to get down underground, and work and then be brought to the surface again, working in all sorts of different areas underground. A union can help managers once unions are established, but only if the union has its members with it. And let me finish these initial remarks with a quote from an interview I did with Marcel Golding at the time that he was, I think, on the Leon Commission doing in Parliament. He says, "The shaft structures were critical in identifying leadership and building leadership. But I must say that at the same time, a lot of credit must go to the workers themselves. Sometimes workers couldn't speak English, but they were very articulate in knowing what was right and what was wrong. And they were very articulate in knowing what they wanted, and they were very suspicious. Thus, until you proved yourself, you were not accepted. You never go and tell the workers anything. You first go and you listen, and then you say, what specifically is the problem? Having understood that, you say, where do you want to go? Then you go to management. Then come back and report. But never, ever, just take the liberty of deciding for them. They must decide what to do on their own, and I think that was one of the good things we learned, that mine workers were not fools, that they knew what they wanted despite their levels of education. They were very, very determined. You had to work very hard at maintaining their trust and confidence." So that's a kind of a recognition of the difficulties that face people organizing mine workers. But there's another factor that I want to focus on in the remarks that I have here. I've got a 50-page paper here that I'm trying to summarize in 20 minutes. And that has to do with the initial complications of organizing in mine hostels. It's always said, you know, the NUM had it lucky because they organized compounded workers. But in fact, they could not have organized compounded workers without management giving them access. They never could organize gold fields. They could never, I mean, for years, and until the 1990s, they couldn't organize gold fields, they couldn't organize Anglo-Val, they couldn't organize Rand mines. So that it was important that people got access, that the union got access. Once the union had access, they then had to deal with an already existing set of informal networks. Mine hostels, like all social organizations, were not passive structures dominated by white managers and black indunas. They were hives of social activity, myriad informal networks, differentiated and overlapping in manifold ways. There were informal networks of homeboys, often cutting across mines, drinking buddies, room groups, work groups, including worker committees, ethnic organizations, sports teams, criminal gangs, church congregations, ethnic associations, stokvels, and people on the make and people on the take. The union had to organize in the midst of the already existing informal organization of a hostel. And when eventually people started being paid living out alliances, the union, things got even worse for the union because it had to also organize people living in Nkukus, living in informal settlements where there were also already existing informal networks. And once the union got organized, then it created formal networks that had informal networks associated with them. So that the idea that somehow it's easy to organize mine workers is deeply problematic. It's never been easy. It's always involved getting trust from people who are interested in workplace issues, but often also have side issues that are their own. And if you look at the history of the union, in platinum, it's particularly true that the NUM had to work with what it had. It ultimately did so quite successfully, but it also increasingly in the new century began to lose touch with its members. For reasons that are structural reasons that have been, some of which have been addressed and which I'm actually not going to address particularly, but which are very troubling. Troubling for the union and also troubling for the workers. And you get, it's complicated. On Amplats, for instance, Paul Stewart has said that there were, and he's one of the few people who's actually had access to some of the Amplats management documents. Managers at Amplats were negotiating with rock drill operators, Paul says, from 1985. The union was recognized in 1990. The union, in fact, had a strike vote in 1990, so it was recognized actually in 1989. But management kept talking to rock drill operators. The deal was that the management would talk to the rock drill operators if they didn't go on strike. So that there's a long history. And I suspect that Amplats was very happy to talk to the rock drill operators outside of the union networks. So that they could play, to some extent, play the one off against the other. Although I think that Paul is right that rock drill operators' concerns were largely, essentially, workplace concerns. The whole situation on on platinum was, of course, enormously complicated by the fact that the platinum mines sit astride, or sat astride, the old Bophuthatswana state, put it in quotes. If you look at the rise of the Union on Impala, which is a very, very, very interesting story, it's a story of informal worker organization. In 1986, and this really gets things complicated, because it's not only Bophuthatswana, it's also what's happening in GenCorp. In 1986, Impala fired its entire workforce. 27,000 workers were fired. And they were not just fired, they were fired by being put in buses and sent home. They were, except for Bafokeng, for Wildekust Fontaine North, where John Smithies was the manager. And I was told John Smithies said quietly to his guys, go out and come back down, we're not going to worry about buses. They were, Smithies got his shaft back in his mine back in production again in 2 weeks. The rest of the Impala mines, it took 6 months. For 6 months, they weren't getting much production at all. It was a total disaster. I've got management documents from GenCorp, and the Impala management are basically, as I read those documents, saying we cannot have another set of mass dismissals. Anglo learned the same thing in 1985, by the way, at Vaal Reef South. Mass dismissals destroy production, not only for 6 months, sometimes for years. So that there was a distinct willingness on the, and it's also, there's another complication. The manager of mining at GenCorp was a guy called Johan Fritz, who was an old-style mine manager. He was the one who said, blacks don't understand negotiation. You just have to tell them what to do. He's the guy who fired those. He's the guy who insisted that they fired at the beginning of '86. In the middle of 1986, Derek Keys took over GenCorp, turned it around 180 degrees. GenCorp had been in the Goldfields Anglo-Vaal camp. It moved into the Anglo-JCI camp within an extraordinarily short period of time. And you've got a completely different set of managers at Impala who were open to the idea of negotiation, and but who were also bound by their by the limitations of the Bophuthatswana government. And in 1991, they negotiated with the Bophuthatswana Sweetheart Union, about 7% membership on their mines, a wage settlement, at the same time that NUM got a wage settlement from Anglo Platinum that was substantially better. And the workers themselves came out. This was informal, completely informal organization. There was next to no formal, there was no formal and next to no informal organization of the NUM at the time. The workers came out, management approached the NUM basically. They started negotiating with the workers, and it wasn't going well at all. One thing about NUM is they're good negotiators. They're skilled, they've had a lot of experience. They get called in, and an informal process of negotiation happens, basically, where ultimately a very good settlement is arrived at. But it's arrived at a point where, and I've got the documents, where management at Impala is being taken to Mabato and being shouted at by Mangope. I mean, Mangope basically said, why don't you dismiss these guys, the NUM, we don't accept the NUM, we don't recognize the NUM. So Impala went back, the Impala managers went back to the NUM and said, look, please apply for registration. Even an application for registration will be sufficient for us to be able to sign people up. And they invited Motlatsi to speak, which I can tell you did not please Mangope. But they signed up. Within a month or two, they had signed up 30,000 members. But they couldn't be members of the NUM because the NUM was banned, basically. And eventually, I mean, it's a long story and I don't have time to go into all the details, but eventually the NUM got recognition. Next. The story on Amplatz is another very, very complicated story that also involves informal networks. Not only the Rock Drillers organization, but also a group that called themselves the Five Madorda. In 1995, 96, the Five Madorda, who seemed to have been a group of people from Botswana land, who seem to have been, as far as I can make out, a group who were members of a vigilante organization in Botswana, which was organized in order to deal with cattle theft, who then, there were a couple of white guys who were insurance salesmen who persuaded the Five Madorda to form a union, which became the Mouthpiece Workers Union, which then engaged in a whole series of vigilante hit squad activities. And I suspect that, in fact, management was quite happy to talk to Mouthpiece and to weaken the NUM. So the NUM struggled on Impala and came into being because of informal organization on the part of workers. The NUM was weakened and virtually destroyed on Amplatz because of informal worker organization. The NUM recovered in the early 2000s, but I don't think that their organization was ever particularly strong. And the story of the period, the first decade of this century, is a story of struggles in Rustenburg that are complicated by the internal politics, apparently, of the Rustenburg region, but are also deeply involved in a lack of consultation with worker groups on the part of the regional office of the union. Head office kept getting called in. You just have to read the secretariat reports. Read the 2004 secretariat report from NUM. There was always trouble getting support in the Rustenburg region. If you look at the SWOP survey in 1998, the Rustenburg region is a model of disorganization. If you look at the SWOP survey for 2005, the Rustenburg region comes lower than any other in terms of satisfaction with service for workers. If you look at the SWOP survey for 2010, it's even worse. So that the situation was one where, as I read the historical evidence, the union was failing to do exactly what Marcel Golding told me in 1995 every union had to do. It wasn't listening to the workers, and it wasn't delivering to the workers' satisfaction. So that you eventually get situations where deputy secretary generals of the union are being stoned at meetings, and you get independent worker organizations which, because of conflicts within the union, particularly at Korea actually to begin with, people are no longer trust the union to deliver the goods for them. And in fact, AMCU did not come to the platinum mining industry because because it was an AMCU initiative. AMCU came because worker committees called them in. Informal organization of workers very unhappy with the NUM called in AMCU. The strike wave that is the topic of the rest of this session takes the story up from there. But I did want to emphasize the importance of recognizing the problems that NUM face prior to the coming of any kind of suggestion of AMCU.
Right. Thank you, Dunbar, for that very valuable history of organisation and also the crucial role of informal organisation, informal networks. One point I wanted to comment on, I mean, you're quite right that NUM approached us constantly to do reports on service delivery, and they were all very critical. I think the question I'd like to put to you here is it's not that they were self-critical, but they didn't really implement the points. And I think that's a question really that I think NUM needs to reflect on. I think they were very open to us doing that research, and I think for that they needed that to credit. But what's puzzled me and continues to puzzle me is why they were unable to really make the recommendations that arose out of that report, but maybe became a insider's view. Over to you, Christman.
Thank you, Prof. Firstly, I would like to say today we are very fortunate. I have some of my key informants are part of the audience here. I think they will be able to rescue me if they're part of some of the key people that I interacted with when I was doing my research in Rustenburg. They are also part of the audience today. Firstly, I would start off with, this is part of an ongoing project where I am trying to understand the variation strike violence in post-apartheid South Africa, where I'm drawing case studies from the Rustenburg Platinum Belt. So I started this project in 2010, and I started my field work towards the end of 2011 and lived in Rustenburg for 14 months. I lived in the informal settlement at number 8, number 9, which is one of the biggest, the largest informal settlement in Rustenburg. We are trying to understand some of the issues that my research question is trying to address. And I've also lived in the Rustenburg town for the part of the 14 months that I lived in Rustenburg. But for this paper, my focus will be on, I'm trying to explain the interplay between solidarity and fragmentation, which characterized this strike wave, starting at Impala in January 2012, right up to the culmination of the Marikana, what became the Marikana massacre. I started off in January in 2012, and that was the time when I was in the field there. In actual fact, I was in Marikana mine. And what characterized the strike is the unprecedented levels in terms of when you look at the worker militants and workers presenting what some uncompromising demand I think at that time in Impala Platinum Mine, the rock drill operators, they wanted like 9,000, which was almost double for what they were getting at that point in time. And you see that the workers were organized on their own through workers' committees, they were organized outside the hegemonic powers, which is outside the institutional structures. In particular, the rejection of the NUM by the workers and the rise of, which is not a new union, AMCO has been in existence since 1998, but we see an outright rejection of the NUM, which is vindicated by the fact that after the strike wave, we see AMCO emerging to become the dominant union in the platinum mine. It's now the dominant union in Impala, it's now the dominant union at Lonmin. And this strike wave was also characterized by violence, workers presenting similar claims, and there's also similar in terms of the actors. We've got the NUM, we've got AMCO, we've got Independent Workers Committee. And in terms of the violence, you see workers drawing from the same repertoires. And there's high levels of fragmentation in terms of differentiation, and at the same time, they also indication to high level of worker solidarity. Conceptually, by solidarity here, I mean community of interest and realization that interest by workers can be advanced collectively. And this is encapsulated in the trade union maxim, which we call an injury to one is an injury to all. In my trade union, we used to call touch one, touch all. Then fragmentation, by fragmentation I mean the breaking into small or separate parties. And in this current dispensation of neoliberal globalization, it's an ongoing process, and it's always shifting. Because when you look at it without fragmentation and differentiation, there won't be any need for workers' solidarity. Solidarity is because of the fact that fragmentation and worker differentiation then becomes imperative for workers to build some sort of solidarity. Then, in terms of theoretically, we have by solidarity. Richard Heinemann gives a definition to solidarity. He argues that it is a utopia, it's something that is unrealizable, fictitious, unattainable, illusory. It's imaginary, yet at the same time is capable of inspiring action. It's a project to reconcile differences of situation and interest. It's a slogan simply because labor is not united. Then at the same time, we've got Rick Fantasia, 1988. He argues that solidarity is a source of strength which is shaped by past legacy. Then I would sort of briefly try to look at what I could call the contours of fragmentation that sort of came into fore in this strike wave. Firstly, there is a growing externalization of work, which is subcontracting, labor broking. I think these contours sort of like help us to understand the underlying dynamics in the strike action itself. Then there's also the new settlement geography. We see the proliferation of formal settlement. Then we also see a broadening of skill level, then continuities and discontinuities in the migrant labor system. And also we see, interestingly, a difference in the language that is used by the different players. There's a difference in terms of when you look at the language that is used by the NUM and the language that is used by AMCO and the Workers' Committee, which is very important in terms of maybe trying to understand this strike wave. Then there's a growing externalization which is in line with the neoliberal globalization. Because simply neoliberal in terms of globalization, it thrives on the fragmentation and differentiation of workers, more like a divide and rule. You maximize appropriation of surplus value through dividing the workers, then you maximize profit for the capitalist. And behind this background, we see a situation where, in terms of the mining sector, in South Africa, the platinum mining sector has one of the highest levels in terms of externalized workers, where we see that at least 30% of the workers in the platinum mining sectors, they are employed through subcontractors and labor brokers. For example, these figures from which I extracted from the company's financial end-of-year reports, this as at January 2012, where we see one of the fourth biggest mining company, which was virtually almost out of like 12,000 workers, 10,000 of these workers were engaged through subcontractors, which is Aquarius